It's 1,538 degrees Celsius. That's the temperature at which pure iron finally surrenders and turns to liquid. Hold that number in your head for a second. Feel how absurd it is. Now look down at your hand. If you're holding a phone, there's iron in it. If you're near a doorknob, a key, a zipper, a kitchen knife, a screw in the chair beneath you, iron. Cold, ordinary, forgettable. That forgettable metal shouldn't exist in your hand, not by any reasonable measure of what early humans should have been able to do. So why does a rock that refuses to melt below the temperature of a volcano's throat end up in a drawer in your kitchen, mass-produced, disposable, invisible? Let's rewind further than you think, because the honest answer to how did humans discover iron is not the answer you were taught. It isn't a clever blacksmith. It isn't the Hittites hoarding a secret. It isn't one bright morning when someone dropped a red rock into a hot fire and pulled out a sword. The real story is stranger. It begins in the sky. It passes through a rock that refuses to give up its metal. And it ends, quietly, in a nail you would step over without noticing. Picture a workshop somewhere in the ancient Near East. A clay furnace, taller than a child, patched and cracked from previous burns. Charcoal glowing inside it, a person crouched beside a bellows, arms shining with sweat, pumping air into the belly of the thing. The smoke stings, the heat is painful before you even touch it, and inside the fire, something impossible is quietly happening. The iron is not melting. It never needed to. That is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong. When we imagine ancient metalworking, we imagine molten rivers of orange metal pouring into molds. That's bronze. That's copper. That is not what happened with early iron. Early iron workers were not melting iron ore. They were doing something far cleverer, and they were doing it without knowing what chemistry was. They were stripping oxygen out of stone. Inside that clay furnace, hot carbon-rich gas from the charcoal is pulling oxygen atoms off the iron oxide in the ore. The rock is being chemically undone. What remains is metallic iron, mixed with a glassy waste called slag, sitting near the furnace floor as a lumpy, sponge-like mass called a bloom. It looks nothing like a sword. It looks like a filthy, glowing sponge. And when the smith drags it out with wooden tongs, half the work is still ahead of them, because hammering that bloom over and over is what squeezes the slag out and welds the iron together. Their thermometer was the furnace itself. Their instrument was their own eyes, ears, hands. They were controlling a chemical reaction they could not name, with tools they did not consciously understand, and they were doing it well. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before any of this, before the furnaces, before the bellows, before the bloom, humans had already met iron. Just not in a rock. Roughly 5,200 years ago, in a cemetery near a village called Gerza in northern Egypt, someone was buried with 9 small iron beads strung among gold and gemstones. That was more than 2,000 years before Egypt had any meaningful iron industry. Those beads shouldn't have existed. And when researchers finally analyzed them, they found something strange in the metal. Nickel. Far too much nickel to have come from any earthly ore. The beads were made of meteorite. Someone, 5 millennia ago, had picked up a dense, dark, unusually heavy fragment of stone that had fallen out of the sky. They had struck it, and instead of shattering like ordinary rock, it deformed. It bent. It behaved like metal, and then, this is the part that makes me stop every time I read it. They didn't just carve it. They hammered it flat into a thin sheet and rolled that sheet into a tube 9 times over to make jewelry. They did not know what a meteorite was. They did not know what nickel was. They only knew that this thing from the sky obeyed the hammer. Centuries later, a young king named Tutankhamun was buried with a dagger. Its blade also carries the nickel signature of a meteorite. A pharaoh's weapon, forged from a piece of space, in an age when almost no one on Earth could yet coax iron out of ordinary stone. When I first read about the Gerza beads, I had to read it twice. Because it means something almost no textbook admits out loud. Humanity discovered iron before it discovered how to make iron. We held the finished product in our hands, wore it around our necks, buried it with our dead, long before we understood that the same element was locked inside every red rock we walked past. And that is where the real problem begins. Because meteorites don't fall on schedule. You cannot build a civilization on metal that arrives from the sky at random. If iron was going to matter, really matter, the way it eventually would, humans had to learn to pull it out of the ground beneath their feet, out of the ordinary, out of the red, rusty, useless-looking rock that was, quite literally, everywhere. And that is a much harder trick. Imagine standing in front of a hillside streaked with iron ore. You have no chemistry, you have no periodic table, you have no concept of oxidation. All you have is fire, air, charcoal, clay, hands, and each other. And somehow, over generations, people worked out that if you build the fire in a certain shape and feed it a certain fuel and push air into it at a certain rate and pack it with certain crushed rocks, sometimes, at the bottom, you find a stubborn lump of something that behaves like metal. Sometimes, not always, that's the cruelty of it. Because early iron was not automatically better than bronze. That's the second thing almost everyone gets wrong. Bronze, by the time iron showed up, was a mature, respected, high-performing technology. Beautiful castings, sharp edges, trusted molds. Generations of trade routes moving copper and tin across seas. To an ancient smith, replacing bronze with iron was not an obvious upgrade. It was a gamble, a slag-filled, brittle, unpredictable gamble. A bad bloom, poorly forged, would bend under a blow that bronze would have shrugged off. Imagine trusting your axe to it, swinging at a tree you need to fell before winter, and feeling the edge roll over. Hours of work vanished into a useless lump. Charcoal gone, ore gone, time gone, and the bronze axe your grandfather used is still sitting in the corner, working perfectly. That is why, for a long stretch of human history, iron was a curiosity. A prestige metal, a strange side experiment sitting beside a technology that already worked. And here's the part that unsettles the classic story. There is no single inventor of iron, no lone genius, no Iron Age Edison. The tidy legend of the Hittites guarding a secret formula collapses under closer archaeology. What the evidence actually shows is a slow, uneven, region-by-region drift. One smith improving furnace clay, another noticing that a certain ore behaves differently, a third accidentally leaving iron in contact with hot charcoal long enough to absorb carbon and become something closer to steel. Small changes, small people, across centuries. By the late 10th century BCE, at a site called Tanakh, some smiths were producing carburized iron of genuinely impressive quality, while other workshops nearby were still turning out inconsistent, brittle blooms. Two settlements, close enough to trade, producing iron worlds apart. That is what a technology looks like before it becomes reliable. And this is where the deepest program in our species quietly reveals itself. Because the moment you accept that no one person invented iron, you have to accept something else. The knowledge lived in the group, in the apprentice watching the old smith's hands, in the child hauling charcoal because that's how you learn what dry charcoal sounds like, in the woman who knew which red rocks were worth carrying home, in the bellows operator who had felt 1,000 furnaces breathe. Iron did not live in one skull. It lived in a network of skulls, stitched together by imitation, memory, and trust, generation after generation, none of them able to write the recipe down, all of them able to perform it. We inherited that behavior. It never disappeared. Somewhere inside you, it is still running. Watch what you actually do when you buy a car, or take a medicine, or step into an elevator. You don't personally verify the metallurgy. You don't test the pharmacology. You don't inspect the cables. You look for signals, reputation, certification, someone competent who has done this before, and you follow. You copy the successful. You lean on strangers. Your brain does this so smoothly, you barely notice. It is the same instinct that stood behind an ancient apprentice, silently watching an old smith swing a hammer, learning by rhythm what no one could have explained in words. I've always found this next part hard to accept, but I think it's true. You are not the reason your world works. Neither am I. Ask yourself honestly, could you produce 1 gram of iron from rock with no modern tools? Could you find the ore, choose the right fuel, build a furnace that survives its own heat? Read the color of a flame the way an experienced smelter reads it? Almost none of us could. And yet we live inside a civilization built entirely on such knowledge. Psychologists have a name for the gap between how well we think we understand ordinary things and how well we actually do. They call it the illusion of explanatory depth. Ask someone how a zipper works, or a toilet, or a refrigerator. They'll be confident until they try to explain. Then the confidence collapses. We walk through a world we barely understand, and we feel like we understand it because someone, somewhere, does. That is not a modern flaw. That is a 5,000-year-old strategy that finally scaled. The ancient smith did not understand oxidation. He understood the pattern. The pattern was enough. His neighbor did not understand the smith's craft. She understood who to trust. Trust was enough. Multiply that across generations, across villages, across continents, and eventually, the impossible becomes ordinary. The metal from the sky becomes the metal in the plow. The prestige bead becomes the disposable nail. That is the real answer to how humans discovered iron. Not one moment, not one mind. A long, patient, mostly nameless chain of people learning to see something inside a rock that nature refused to show them. And more importantly, learning how to make that seeing survive their own deaths. Look again at whatever piece of steel is nearest to you right now. A hinge, a screw, the frame of your chair. It is one of the most historically strange objects in the room, and it looks like nothing. That is not because its story shrank. It is because we stopped noticing it. The miracle didn't disappear. Our attention did. Humanity spent thousands of years turning a metal that fell from the sky into a metal you kick out of your way in a hardware store. That is not a small thing. That is what a technological revolution looks like after everyone has forgotten to be amazed. A nail is a pharaoh's dagger, drained of its rarity. A doorknob is a Gurza bead, drained of its wonder. The knowledge that once lived in a handful of glowing workshops now lives everywhere, and nowhere, held quietly in place by strangers you will never meet. And maybe that is the deepest thing iron reveals about us. Not that our ancestors were clever, though they were. Not that our furnaces got hotter, though they did, but that our species, somewhere along the way, learned a trick more powerful than any metal. We learned how to make useful knowledge outlive the person who discovered it. We learned how to hand fire forward. You've been carrying this longer than you realize.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to BackTimes, hit the bell icon, and share this video with someone who loves history.